On a cold March morning in 1873, Colonel Alexander York rode his horse across the windswept plains of Labette County, Kansas, searching for his missing brother. What he discovered beneath a small homestead's floorboards would expose one of the most methodical and brutal murder sprees in American frontier history. The Bender family had transformed their humble inn into a carefully orchestrated killing ground, where guests didn't simply disappear. They were systematically tortured, murdered, and buried alive in shallow graves that stretched across their property like a grotesque cemetery of the forgotten. This is the true story of America's first family of serial killers, whose crimes were so calculated and numerous that they would redefine how law enforcement understood organized murder. The Benders didn't kill for passion or desperation. They killed for profit, for pleasure, and with a methodical precision that suggests something far more disturbing than simple frontier brutality. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about family bonds, human nature, and the darkness that can flourish when civilization is nothing more than a distant promise on an endless horizon. The year 1871 marked a period of explosive westward expansion across the American frontier. Kansas had been granted statehood just a decade earlier, and the promise of cheap land and new opportunities drew thousands of settlers, traders, and fortune-seekers to the vast prairies that stretched endlessly toward the setting sun. Among these pioneers was a family of 4 who would settle along the Great Osage Trail, a crucial route connecting the established towns of Kansas with the untamed territories beyond. The Bender family consisted of John Bender Sr., a man in his 60s whose weathered face and stooped shoulders suggested a lifetime of hard labor. His wife, known only as Ma Bender, a stern-faced woman whose cold eyes seemed to catalogue every stranger who passed their way. Their son, John Jr., a man of about 30, whose limited intellect was apparent to anyone who attempted conversation with him. And Kate Bender, a striking woman in her mid-20s, whose beauty masked an intelligence that would prove far more dangerous than any weapon. They claimed to have migrated from Germany, though their accents and mannerisms suggested a more complex history that none of them were willing to discuss in detail. The family purchased 160 acres of land under the Homestead Act, paying the minimal fees required to claim their stake in the American dream. Their property was strategically located along the Great Osage Trail, approximately 8 miles northeast of the small settlement of Cherryvale, positioning them to intercept travelers who needed food, shelter, and rest during their difficult journeys across the prairie. The Benders constructed a modest one-room cabin that would serve both as their family residence and as a way station for travelers. The building was typical of frontier construction, measuring roughly 16 by 24 feet, with thick log walls and a sod roof designed to withstand the harsh Kansas weather. What made their cabin unique was the way they divided the interior space. A heavy canvas curtain split the room in half, with the front section serving as a general store and dining area for guests, while the back half functioned as the family's private living quarters. Kate Bender quickly established herself as the public face of the family business. Unlike her taciturn father and simple-minded brother, Kate possessed the charm and intelligence necessary to attract customers and put travelers at ease. She was fluent in both English and German, allowing her to communicate with the diverse population of immigrants who traveled the frontier roads. More importantly, Kate had an intuitive understanding of human psychology that enabled her to identify the most vulnerable and profitable potential victims among their guests. Local residents who encountered Kate at community gatherings and church services described her as an unusually sophisticated woman for the frontier setting. She claimed to possess supernatural abilities, advertising herself as a spiritualist and healer who could communicate with the dead and cure various ailments through mystical powers. These claims attracted additional visitors to the Bender homestead, including curious locals and traveling believers seeking spiritual guidance or medical treatment. Kate's supposed supernatural abilities served multiple purposes in the family's criminal enterprise. They provided a legitimate reason for strangers to visit their isolated homestead. They explained away any unusual sounds or activities that neighbors might observe, and they allowed Kate to gather detailed information about potential victims under the guise of spiritual consultation. Travelers seeking Kate's services often revealed valuable information about their backgrounds, destinations, and most importantly, the resources they carried with them. The Bender Inn quickly developed a reputation for providing hearty meals and adequate shelter at reasonable prices. The family served simple but filling frontier fare, salt pork, cornbread, beans and coffee that helped restore travelers after long days on the difficult prairie roads. Their prices were competitive with other way stations along the route, and Kate's charm ensured that most guests left with positive impressions of their experience. What guests could not have known was that every aspect of their visit was being carefully evaluated by the Bender family. The family had developed a systematic method for assessing the potential profitability of murdering each guest. They considered factors such as the amount of money and valuables the traveler appeared to be carrying, whether the guest was traveling alone or with companions, how well known the person might be in surrounding communities, and how quickly their disappearance might be noticed and investigated. The psychological profile that emerges from studying the Bender family reveals a criminal organization that operated with chilling efficiency and coordination. Each family member played a specific role that maximized their collective ability to identify, capture, torture, and murder their victims while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operators. John Bender Sr.'s role as the primary executioner required not only physical strength, but also the psychological capacity to inflict maximum suffering on helpless victims. Witnesses who survived encounters with the family described him as a man whose eyes held no warmth or human compassion, suggesting a complete absence of empathy that enabled him to torture people for hours without experiencing normal human revulsion at their suffering. The methodical nature of the family's torture techniques suggests that they had developed their skills through extensive practice and experimentation. Early victims likely suffered less systematic abuse, as the family learned which methods produced the most information and the greatest psychological satisfaction. By the time Dr. William York was murdered, the Benders had refined their techniques to maximize both the extraction of valuable intelligence and their own sadistic pleasure. Kate Bender's psychological profile is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. Her ability to maintain a charming and sympathetic facade while planning the torture and murder of her guests demonstrates a level of psychological compartmentalization that few individuals possess. She could engage travelers in friendly conversation about their families and dreams, while simultaneously evaluating them as potential victims and planning the specific tortures she would inflict upon them. Contemporary accounts describe Kate as possessing an almost supernatural ability to read people's personalities and vulnerabilities. This skill enabled her to identify not only the wealthiest potential victims, but also those who would be most susceptible to psychological manipulation and least likely to resist effectively when the family revealed their true intentions. Her success in gaining victims' trust made their eventual betrayal all the more psychologically devastating. The family's decision to bury some victims alive represents a level of cruelty that goes beyond simple murder for profit. This method served no practical purpose, as victims were already helpless and could have been killed more quickly and quietly through conventional means. The choice to bury living victims appears to have been motivated purely by the family's desire to inflict maximum suffering and to satisfy their sadistic impulses. Evidence discovered during the investigation suggested that the Benders sometimes forced victims to dig their own graves before being tortured and buried alive. This psychological torture added another layer of horror to an already unimaginable ordeal and demonstrated the family's sophisticated understanding of how to maximize their victims' mental and emotional suffering. The family's ability to maintain normal relationships with their neighbors and customers while simultaneously committing systematic murder reveals the extent of their psychological abnormalities. They attended church services, participated in community events, and maintained friendly relationships with local residents who never suspected the horror occurring just beneath their feet at the Bender homestead. Dr. Samuel Morrison, a physician who had treated members of the Bender family for minor ailments, later testified about his interactions with them during the period when their murders were at their peak. He described them as polite, respectful patients who showed no signs of the psychological disturbance that might be expected from individuals engaged in systematic killing. Kate Bender consulted me about headaches and stomach ailments that she claimed were interfering with her spiritual work. Doctor, Morrison recalled. She spoke eloquently about her desire to help suffering people find peace and healing. The contrast between her expressed compassion and her actual activities creates a portrait of evil that challenges our understanding of human nature itself. The family's first confirmed victim was Dr. William York, a respected physician from Independence, Kansas, who disappeared while traveling to visit his brother in Fort Scott in May 1872. Dr. York was an ideal target from the Benders' perspective. He traveled alone, carried medical supplies and instruments that could be sold for substantial sums, and had mentioned during his stay that he was conducting confidential business that required him to avoid the main traveled roads. Dr. York had stopped at the Bender Inn during a rainstorm that made travel dangerous and uncomfortable. Kate had engaged him in conversation about his medical practice and his travel plans, skillfully drawing out information about his route and timeline. The doctor had mentioned that he was expected in Fort Scott within a few days, but that his brother would not be concerned if he arrived late, due to weather or road conditions. The murder of Dr. York established the pattern that the Bender family would follow for dozens of subsequent victims. After determining that the doctor was a suitable target, the family waited for the optimal moment to act. Their method was as simple as it was effective. When Dr. York was seated at the rough wooden table eating his evening meal, with his back to the canvas curtain that divided the room, John Bender Sr. approached silently from behind and struck him in the head with a heavy hammer. The blow was carefully calculated to render the victim unconscious, but not immediately fatal. The Benders had learned through experimentation that a quick death reduced their opportunities to extract information about hidden valuables or to prolong the victim's suffering for their own sadistic pleasure. Dr. York was dragged behind the canvas curtain while still breathing, where the family would spend hours torturing him to reveal the location of any money or valuables he might have hidden. The torture methods employed by the Bender family were systematic and designed to maximize both information extraction and the family's sadistic pleasure. They used heated metal implements to burn sensitive areas of the victim's body, applied pressure to joints and extremities to cause excruciating pain without immediately fatal damage, and employed psychological torture by describing in detail what they planned to do to the victim's family members if they did not cooperate fully. Dr. York's ordeal lasted through the night and into the following day. The family took turns inflicting pain and demanding information about money, valuables, and business connections that might prove profitable. When they were satisfied that they had extracted all useful information, or when the victim could no longer respond coherently to their questions, they would complete the murder using methods that ensured the victim experienced maximum suffering before death. The disposal of Dr. York's body introduced another horrifying aspect of the Bender family's methods. Rather than simply burying their victim in a grave, they had constructed a carefully designed system for concealing bodies that would make discovery unlikely, even if someone specifically searched their property. Beneath their cabin, they had excavated a cellar that was not visible to casual observers, but provided access to an underground chamber large enough to hold multiple bodies. The cellar served as a temporary storage area where bodies could be kept while the family decided on permanent disposal methods. In Dr. York's case, as with most subsequent victims, the body was eventually buried in a shallow grave in their orchard, positioned so that newly planted apple trees would grow from the disturbed soil and make the burial site appear to be nothing more than normal agricultural activity. The success of Dr. York's murder encouraged the Bender family to expand their operation and refine their methods. They realized that their isolated location and the transient nature of frontier travel created ideal conditions for systematic murder and robbery. Travelers who disappeared along the Great Osage Trail were often assumed to have been killed by hostile Native Americans, wild animals, or natural disasters, rather than by fellow settlers. Over the following months, the frequency of murders at the Bender homestead increased dramatically. The family developed efficiency in their methods that allowed them to kill multiple victims per week during busy travel seasons. They became expert at reading the subtle signs that indicated a traveler might be carrying significant wealth, the quality of their clothing and equipment, their knowledge of financial markets, their familiarity with expensive goods, and most importantly, their level of caution when discussing their business affairs. Kate's role in the operation became increasingly sophisticated as she learned to manipulate victims psychologically before their murders. She would engage travelers in conversation about their families, their hopes for the future, and their fears about frontier life. This information served multiple purposes. It helped identify the most vulnerable targets. It provided psychological leverage during torture sessions, and it satisfied Kate's apparent sadistic pleasure in causing emotional as well as physical pain. The family also developed a network of contacts who helped them dispose of stolen goods without attracting suspicion. They established relationships with unscrupulous traders in distant towns who asked no questions about the origins of valuable items offered for sale. They learned to alter or remove identifying marks from stolen goods, making it difficult for investigators to connect recovered items to specific victims. John Jr.'s role in the family enterprise, despite his limited intellectual capacity, was crucial to their success. His physical strength made him ideal for subduing victims and disposing of bodies, while his apparent mental limitations provided perfect cover for the family's activities. Neighbors and casual visitors often dismissed John Jr. as a harmless simpleton, never suspecting that he was capable of participating in systematic murder. Ma Bender's contributions were less visible, but equally important. She managed the practical aspects of their operation, including food preparation, financial record-keeping, and communication with suppliers and customers. Her stern demeanor and careful attention to detail ensured that their legitimate business activities appeared normal and attracted no suspicion from local authorities or neighbors. The family's success in avoiding detection for more than a year was due partly to their careful victim selection and partly to the social and economic conditions of the frontier. Local law enforcement was minimal and poorly coordinated, making it difficult to track missing persons across county lines. Communication between communities was slow and unreliable, allowing the Benders to stay ahead of any investigations that might threaten their operation. By the winter of 1872, the Bender family had murdered at least 15 people and accumulated wealth that far exceeded what any legitimate frontier business could have generated. They possessed gold and silver coins, expensive jewelry, fine clothing, quality firearms, and other valuable items that would have aroused suspicion if displayed openly, but could be gradually converted to cash through their network of corrupt traders. The family's confidence in their methods led them to take increasingly bold risks. They began targeting not only isolated travelers, but also groups of 2 or 3 people who could be overwhelmed through surprise and superior numbers. They developed techniques for killing multiple victims simultaneously, reducing the risk that anyone might escape to report their crimes. One particularly horrific example of their evolving methods occurred in January 1873, when a family of 3 German immigrants sought shelter at the Bender Inn during a severe winter storm. The family consisted of Heinrich Müller, age 45, a skilled carpenter who had saved enough money to purchase tools and establish a workshop in Kansas City, his wife Maria, age 38, who had worked as a seamstress to help accumulate their savings, and their daughter Greta, age 16, who dreamed of attending school in America and becoming a teacher. The Müller family represented an ideal target. They traveled with substantial cash saved over years of careful planning, had no local connections who would immediately notice their disappearance, and spoke limited English that made them dependent on the Benders for assistance and information. Kate used her German language skills to gain their trust and extract detailed information about their resources and travel plans. The murder of the Müller family demonstrated the Benders' increasing sophistication and sadism. Rather than killing all 3 victims quickly, they decided to use the situation for maximum psychological torture. They murdered Heinrich first, forcing Maria and Greta to watch while they tortured him for information about hidden money. They discovered that Heinrich had sewn gold coins into the lining of his coat, a common practice among immigrants who distrusted banks and paper currency. After extracting all useful information from Heinrich, the family turned their attention to Maria, forcing Greta to watch as they subjected her mother to prolonged torture. The psychological impact of watching her parents being murdered while knowing she would face the same fate was intended to break Greta's resistance and make her more willing to reveal any additional resources the family might have hidden. The torture of the Müller family lasted for 2 days, during which the Benders experimented with new techniques designed to maximize suffering while keeping victims conscious and responsive. They used heated knives to make shallow cuts that would cause intense pain without fatal blood loss, applied burning embers to sensitive areas of the body, and employed psychological torture by forcing family members to participate in each other's suffering. When the Benders had exhausted the entertainment value of torturing the Muller family, they decided to try a new method of murder that would satisfy their sadistic impulses while also serving as an experiment in victim disposal. Rather than killing the family members outright, they decided to bury all 3 victims alive, allowing them to experience the ultimate horror of suffocation while trapped in their own graves. The burial site chosen for the Miller family was located in a remote section of the Bender orchard, where disturbed soil could be disguised as normal agricultural activity. The graves were dug to a depth that would prevent easy escape, but not so deep as to require excessive labor. Each family member was lowered into their grave while still conscious, though weakened by days of torture and unable to resist effectively. The psychological torture continued even during the burial process, as the Benders described in detail how long it would take for each victim to suffocate and what they would experience during their final moments. They threw dirt slowly onto the conscious victims, pausing periodically to ask if they had remembered any additional information that might spare their lives, knowing full well that nothing could save them at that point. The screams and pleas of the Muller family could be heard for several hours after their burial, providing the Benders with sadistic satisfaction that exceeded even their usual torture sessions. The family took turns sitting near the burial sites, listening to the gradually weakening sounds of their victims' final struggles, and timing how long it took for each person to die. This method of murder became the Benders' preferred technique for victims they particularly wanted to terrorize, or when they had sufficient time to enjoy prolonged torture. The knowledge that some of their victims had been buried alive added an extra dimension of horror to their crimes that went far beyond simple murder for profit. The specific techniques Kate used to manipulate her victims psychologically were revealed through the testimonies of the few individuals who survived encounters with the family. These survivors described how Kate would gradually shift conversations from general topics to more personal subjects, skillfully extracting information about family relationships, business affairs, and financial resources. One survivor, a traveling salesman named Robert Henderson, later testified about his experience at the Bender Inn in early 1873. Henderson had been traveling with a substantial amount of sample merchandise and cash when he stopped at the homestead seeking shelter during a winter storm that made continuing travel impossible. "Kate Bender seemed genuinely interested in my family and my business," Henderson recalled during his testimony to investigators. "She asked about my wife and children with what appeared to be sincere concern, and she listened attentively when I described the challenges of traveling sales work. She wanted to know about my route, my customers, and especially about how much money I typically carried when traveling." Henderson's survival was apparently due to the arrival of other travelers who made it impractical for the family to murder him without creating witnesses. However, his testimony provided valuable insights into the family's victim selection process and the psychological techniques they used to gather intelligence about potential targets. "I realize now that every question Kate asked was designed to evaluate whether I would be a profitable victim and whether my disappearance would be quickly noticed," Henderson continued. "She was particularly interested in my travel schedule and whether anyone was expecting me at specific times and places. When I mentioned that my business partner tracked my movements carefully and would contact law enforcement if I failed to report in regularly, I noticed a change in her demeanor. The family's systematic approach to robbery was revealed through the discovery of detailed inventories that Kate maintained describing stolen goods and their estimated values. These records, discovered during the investigation of their property, demonstrated that the Benders were not simply opportunistic killers who murdered for whatever valuables their victims happened to carry. Instead, they carefully evaluated the potential profitability of each murder and specifically targeted individuals whose deaths would generate the greatest financial rewards. Kate's inventory records also revealed the family's sophisticated understanding of how to dispose of stolen goods without attracting suspicion. They had established relationships with corrupt merchants in distant towns, who would purchase valuable items without asking questions about their origins. The family rotated their sales among multiple buyers in different communities, ensuring that no single merchant would notice patterns that might alert law enforcement to their activities. The record showed that the family had developed a pricing system for different types of victims, based on their estimated wealth and the difficulty of disposing of their bodies without detection. Professional men like doctors and lawyers commanded premium rates due to their typically high incomes and valuable possessions. Wealthy farmers and ranchers were also preferred targets, as their disappearances might be attributed to various frontier hazards rather than foul play. The geographic scope of the family's crimes was much broader than initially realized during the original investigation. Evidence discovered years later suggested that the Benders had operated similar murder schemes at previous locations before establishing their homestead in Kansas. They appear to have moved from place to place, operating for a year or two in each location before abandoning their crimes and relocating to avoid detection. This pattern of geographic mobility explains how the family was able to evade capture so successfully after their Kansas crimes were discovered. They had apparently planned their escape route in advance and possessed both the resources and the experience necessary to disappear effectively when their criminal activities were threatened with exposure. Federal investigators who studied the case in later years identified possible connections between the Bender family and similar murder sprees that occurred in Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas during the same general time period. While definitive proof was never established, the similarities in methods and victim profiles suggested that the family might have been responsible for dozens of additional murders beyond those committed in Kansas. The investigation revealed evidence that the Bender family was part of a larger criminal network that included other individuals and families engaged in similar activities across the frontier region. Correspondence found in their belongings included coded communications with associates in other states who appeared to be sharing information about potential victims and profitable opportunities for robbery and murder. This criminal network operated by sharing intelligence about wealthy travelers, coordinating activities to avoid detection, and providing mutual assistance with the disposal of stolen goods and the elimination of potential witnesses. The sophistication of this network suggested that organized crime on the frontier was far more extensive and well-developed than law enforcement agencies had previously understood. The network included corrupt officials in various law enforcement agencies who provided advance warning about impending investigations in exchange for financial compensation or other considerations. This corruption was essential to the Benders' success in avoiding detection and capture, as it allowed them to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts and modify their operations when necessary to avoid exposure. Messages found in the Bender property revealed that Kate maintained regular correspondence with criminal contacts throughout the region, sharing information about profitable targets and coordinating activities to avoid conflicts between different criminal operations. These communications demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that challenged contemporary assumptions about frontier crime as primarily impulsive and disorganized. The family's success in avoiding capture was also aided by systematic corruption within local law enforcement agencies and government institutions. Several officials who had been involved in the initial investigation were later discovered to have accepted bribes or other considerations in exchange for providing advance warning about impending law enforcement activities. Sheriff Thomas Mackenzie, who had been responsible for coordinating the initial search of the Bender property, was revealed to have delayed critical aspects of the investigation long enough for the family to escape with most of their portable wealth. Mackenzie's bank records, examined during a later federal investigation, showed deposits that corresponded to periods when he had access to information about planned law enforcement activities against the family. The corruption that enabled the Bender family's crimes extended beyond individual officials to include systematic failures in communication and coordination between different law enforcement agencies. The lack of effective information sharing between county, state, and federal authorities created gaps that experienced criminals could exploit to avoid detection and capture. Deputy Sheriff William Clark, who had been assigned to monitor the Bender property during the early stages of the investigation, later testified that he had been instructed by his superiors to conduct only superficial surveillance and to report any significant developments to Sheriff Mackenzie, rather than taking independent action to apprehend the suspects. "I knew something was wrong with the Bender family from my first visit to their property," Clark testified, during a later investigation into law enforcement corruption. "The way they behaved, the condition of their property, and the stories they told about missing travelers didn't add up. But every time I tried to pursue leads or conduct more thorough investigations, I was told to back off and let the sheriff handle the matter personally." These institutional failures highlighted the need for fundamental reforms in frontier law enforcement that would eventually lead to the establishment of more centralized and coordinated systems for investigating and prosecuting criminal activities that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. The beginning of the end for the Bender family came in March 1873, when Colonel Alexander York began searching for his missing brother, Dr. William York. The colonel was a prominent businessman and former military officer, whose social connections and persistence would prove to be the key factors in exposing the family's crimes and bringing their reign of terror to an end. Colonel York had expected his brother to arrive in Fort Scott within a few days of leaving Independence, but weeks had passed without any word from the doctor. The colonel's initial inquiries through official channels had produced no useful information, leading him to conduct his own investigation along the route his brother would have traveled. The colonel's search brought him into contact with other families and individuals who had reported missing relatives along the same general route. He began to recognize a pattern of disappearances that suggested something more systematic than random frontier violence. His military experience and business background gave him analytical skills that enabled him to organize information more effectively than local law enforcement had done. Colonel York's investigation methodology was systematic and thorough, reflecting his military training and business experience. He created detailed maps showing the locations where travelers had last been seen, compiled timelines of disappearances, and interviewed witnesses who had encountered missing persons along their travel routes. This systematic approach revealed patterns that had been missed by local law enforcement agencies working independently. The colonel's investigation led him to the Bender homestead, where he questioned the family about any travelers they might have seen. Kate and the other family members provided their standard explanations, claiming that Dr. York had stayed with them briefly, but had departed in good health and spirits. They suggested that he might have encountered hostile Native Americans or suffered an accident in the remote areas between their inn and Fort Scott. Colonel York found the family's explanations plausible initially, but something about their demeanor and the condition of their property raised his suspicions. He noticed that their displayed wealth seemed inconsistent with the income from a simple frontier inn, and he observed subtle signs of recent excavation in various parts of their orchard and surrounding grounds. More importantly, Colonel York's inquiries in surrounding communities revealed that the Bender family was associated with an unusually high number of missing person reports. Local residents began sharing information that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively suggested a disturbing pattern of disappearances connected to the Bender homestead. The colonel's persistence in questioning neighbors and local residents revealed additional disturbing information about the Bender family's activities. Mrs. Sarah McKinley, who lived approximately 2 miles from the Bender homestead, reported that she had frequently observed unusual activity at the property during nighttime hours. "I would see lights moving around their property at strange hours," Mrs. McKinley testified. "Sometimes I could hear sounds carrying on the wind that sounded like digging or construction work being done in the middle of the night." When I asked Kate Bender about it, she claimed they were making improvements to their property and preferred to work at night when the weather was cooler. Another neighbor, Farmer James Watson, reported that he had offered to help the Bender family with various agricultural tasks, but had been consistently refused access to their property beyond the immediate area around their cabin. Watson found this unusual, as frontier communities typically operated on principles of mutual assistance and cooperation. Most families welcomed help with heavy work like clearing land or harvesting crops, Watson explained. But the Benders always had excuses for why they didn't need assistance, and they never invited neighbors to see the improvements they claimed to be making. It struck me as odd behavior for people who were supposed to be part of the community. The colonel decided to organize a more systematic investigation involving other concerned families and local law enforcement officials. He recognized that the isolation and limited resources of frontier communities made it easy for criminals to escape detection, but he also understood that coordinated action by determined individuals could overcome these obstacles. Colonel York's organizational skills proved crucial in coordinating the investigation that would ultimately expose the Bender family's crimes. He established communication networks between families of missing persons, created information-sharing systems that allowed investigators to identify patterns across multiple jurisdictions, and applied pressure on law enforcement officials to take coordinated action. In early April 1873, Colonel York returned to the Bender homestead with a group of armed men, including other family members of missing persons and local officials who had finally been convinced to take action. They informed the Bender family that they intended to conduct a thorough search of the property and surrounding areas for evidence of the missing travelers. The family's reaction to this announcement confirmed the colonel's suspicions about their involvement in the disappearances. Rather than cooperating with the search or expressing concern about the missing persons, the Benders became defensive and evasive. Kate claimed that the searchers had no legal authority to examine their property, while other family members refused to answer questions about their activities or the travelers who had stayed with them. John Bender Sr. became particularly agitated when the search party announced their intentions, demanding to see warrants and threatening legal action if his property was searched without proper authorization. His aggressive response contrasted sharply with the cooperative attitude that innocent property owners typically displayed when asked to assist in searches for missing persons. The search party's examination of the Bender property revealed evidence that confirmed their worst fears about the family's activities. In the orchard behind the cabin, investigators found areas where the soil had been disturbed and where plant growth patterns suggested recent burial activity. More disturbing still were the bloodstains discovered beneath the cabin's floorboards and the presence of a concealed cellar that the family had not mentioned during previous questioning. The first body recovered from the Bender property was that of Dr. William York, found buried in a shallow grave near a newly planted apple tree. The condition of the remains confirmed that the doctor had been murdered rather than dying from natural causes or accident. Evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull suggested that he had been struck with a heavy implement, consistent with the family's preferred method of subduing victims. The discovery of Dr. York's body transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a murder investigation that would ultimately reveal the full extent of the Bender family's crimes. As the search expanded to cover the entire property, investigators found additional graves containing the remains of men, women, and children who had disappeared while traveling through the area. The excavation process revealed the horrific extent of the Bender family's systematic murder spree. Bodies were found buried at various depths throughout the property, some in carefully prepared graves, and others in hastily concealed holes that suggested urgent disposal circumstances. The condition of the remains provided evidence of the torture and violence that victims had endured before their deaths. Dr. Morrison, the physician who had previously treated the Bender family, was called to examine the recovered remains and determine causes of death where possible. His medical expertise revealed evidence of systematic torture that exceeded anything he had encountered in his years of frontier medical practice. The victims showed evidence of prolonged torture designed to maximize suffering while keeping them alive as long as possible, Dr. Morrison reported to investigators. Burns from heated implements, cuts from sharp instruments, and bone damage consistent with deliberate breaking of limbs and joints. Most disturbing was evidence that several victims had been buried while still alive. The physician's examination revealed that at least 6 victims had been buried while still breathing, evidenced by scratches inside wooden coffins and burial shrouds torn by victims' desperate attempts to escape their graves. This discovery added another dimension of horror to crimes that already exceeded the imagination of frontier communities accustomed to violence and hardship. The total number of victims discovered at the Bender property was initially estimated at 11, but continued excavation and the discovery of additional burial sites suggested that the actual number was significantly higher. Some estimates placed the total at more than 20 victims, making the Bender family responsible for one of the largest murder sprees in American frontier history. The physical evidence recovered from the burial sites painted a horrific picture of systematic torture and murder that exceeded anything investigators had encountered previously. Many of the victims showed evidence of prolonged torture, including burns from heated implements, cuts from sharp instruments, and bone damage consistent with deliberate infliction of pain over extended periods. The investigation also uncovered the family's systematic approach to robbery and evidence disposal. Hidden caches of stolen goods were found throughout the property, including jewelry, coins, weapons, and personal effects that could be traced to specific victims. The family had maintained detailed records of their crimes, including descriptions of victims and inventories of stolen property that demonstrated the calculated nature of their activities. Kate's personal journal, discovered hidden beneath floorboards in the family's living quarters, provided chilling insights into the psychology of systematic murder. Her entries described victims in clinical terms, evaluating their potential profitability and documenting experimental torture techniques with the detachment of a scientific researcher. Subjects showed unusual resistance to standard pain application, read one typical entry. Required extended session with heated implements before providing information about hidden resources. Recommend longer preliminary torture for similar victim types in future operations. The journal entries revealed that Kate viewed their murder operation as a business enterprise that could be improved through systematic analysis and refinement of techniques. She maintained detailed records of which torture methods produced the best results with different types of victims, and she experimented with new approaches to maximize both information extraction and sadistic satisfaction. As news of the discoveries at the Bender property spread throughout Kansas and neighboring states, the scope of the family's crimes became increasingly apparent. Families from across the region came forward with information about missing relatives who had disappeared while traveling through the area. The pattern that emerged suggested that the Bender family had been systematically murdering travelers for more than 2 years. The revelation of the Bender family's crimes sent shockwaves through frontier communities that had previously viewed random violence as the primary threat to traveler safety. The realization that a seemingly respectable family could systematically murder dozens of people challenged fundamental assumptions about trust and safety in isolated frontier settlements. Law enforcement officials organized a massive manhunt for the Bender family, who had disappeared from their homestead shortly before the investigation began. Evidence suggested that they had abandoned their property hastily, leaving behind personal belongings and livestock that indicated their departure was unplanned and urgent. The timing of their disappearance, occurring just as the investigation was beginning, strongly suggested that they had been warned about the impending search by corrupt law enforcement officials. The search for the Bender family extended across multiple states and continued for several years. Numerous reported sightings and alleged encounters with family members generated hundreds of leads, but none resulted in confirmed captures. The family's apparent ability to evade capture despite intensive law enforcement efforts suggested that they possessed resources and connections that enabled them to stay ahead of their pursuers. Several theories developed about the family's escape and subsequent fate. Some investigators believed that they had fled to Mexico, where the limited law enforcement cooperation would make capture unlikely. Others suggested that they had separated and assumed new identities in different parts of the United States. Still others theorized that they had been killed by vigilante groups or rival criminals who wanted to eliminate potential competitors or threats. The most persistent theory about the family's fate involved reports that they had been captured and executed by vigilante groups before official law enforcement could apprehend them. Several witnesses claimed to have knowledge of summary executions carried out by groups of citizens who had lost family members to the Benders. However, these claims were never substantiated with physical evidence or reliable witness testimony. The failure to capture the Bender family alive meant that many questions about their crimes remained unanswered. Investigators were unable to determine the exact number of victims, the full extent of their criminal network, or the specific methods they had used to avoid detection for such an extended period. The lack of detailed confessions or testimony also made it impossible to understand the psychological dynamics within the family that had enabled their systematic killing spree. The psychological impact of the Bender family crimes on survivors and community members was profound and long-lasting. Many individuals who had stayed at the Bender Inn and survived purely by chance suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty trusting other people. Dr. Morrison, who had treated several members of the community affected by the revelations about the Bender family, documented symptoms that included persistent fear, social withdrawal, and an inability to feel safe in their own homes. These psychological effects spread throughout the surrounding communities as people realized how close they had come to becoming victims of systematic murder. The knowledge that such evil had existed among us, hidden behind smiles and religious pretenses, fundamentally changed how we viewed our neighbors and our community, wrote local minister Reverend James Patterson in his personal journal. The innocence and trust that had characterized frontier communities was replaced by suspicion and fear that took years to overcome. Sarah McKinley, the neighbor who had observed unusual nighttime activities at the Bender property, suffered particularly severe psychological effects after learning the truth about what she had witnessed. She had been unknowingly observing the disposal of murder victims while assuming that the family was simply conducting routine farm work. "I wake up every night hearing those sounds again," McKinley told Dr. Morrison during one of her treatment sessions. "The digging, the moving around in the dark. Now I know I was listening to them burying people alive, and I did nothing to help those poor souls. I could have saved them if I had been braver, if I had investigated instead of just wondering what they were doing." The case also had significant impacts on the role of women in frontier society, as Kate Bender's leadership role in the family's crimes challenged prevailing assumptions about female nature and capabilities. The realization that a woman could be not only capable of systematic murder, but actually serve as the intellectual architect of such crimes, forced communities to reconsider their understanding of gender roles and criminal potential. Legal scholars and criminologists of the era struggled to understand how Kate Bender's intelligence and charm could coexist with such profound evil. Her case became one of the earliest studies in what would later be recognized as psychopathic behavior, contributing to evolving theories about the nature of criminal personality and the possibility of identifying dangerous individuals before they committed violent crimes. Professor Edwin Hamilton of the University of Kansas, who studied the Bender case extensively, wrote in 1875, "Kate Bender represents a form of criminal intelligence that challenges our fundamental assumptions about human nature. Her ability to maintain normal social relationships while planning and executing systematic murder suggests that evil can exist in forms far more sophisticated and dangerous than we have previously understood." The methods developed during the investigation of the Bender family crimes became models for law enforcement agencies throughout the United States. The systematic approach to crime scene analysis, witness interviews, and evidence collection established precedents that influenced criminal investigation techniques for decades. Colonel Alexander York's role in exposing the family's crimes demonstrated the importance of persistent investigation and community involvement in solving complex criminal cases. His refusal to accept official explanations for his brother's disappearance and his determination to organize independent investigation efforts became an example for other individuals facing similar situations. The colonel's success also highlighted the limitations of official law enforcement systems and the potential for private individuals to accomplish goals that government agencies were unable or unwilling to pursue. This recognition led to the development of private detective agencies and citizen investigation groups that would play important roles in frontier law enforcement for many years. York's investigative methodology became a template for missing persons investigations throughout the frontier region. His systematic approach to gathering information, organizing witnesses, and coordinating search efforts demonstrated that complex criminal cases could be solved through determined individual action even when official resources were inadequate. The economic impact of the Bender family crimes was substantial, affecting not only the immediate victims and their families, but also the broader business community that depended on safe and reliable transportation of goods and people throughout the frontier region. Insurance companies began requiring additional documentation and verification procedures before providing coverage for frontier travel and business activities. The realization that systematic murder could be disguised as accidental disappearances led to demands for better security measures and more thorough investigation of suspicious circumstances. Stagecoach companies implemented new security protocols designed to reduce the risk of attacks on their passengers. These measures included traveling in larger groups, maintaining regular communication schedules that would quickly identify missing travelers, and establishing networks of trusted way stations that could provide verified, safe accommodations. The case influenced the development of communication systems and transportation infrastructure throughout Kansas and neighboring territories. Communities recognized that their isolation and poor communication capabilities had contributed to the family's success in avoiding detection, leading to demands for improved telegraph service, better roads, and more frequent law enforcement patrols. Local businesses that had unknowingly facilitated the Bender family's crimes by purchasing stolen goods faced scrutiny and financial losses when their connections to the murders were revealed. Several merchants who had bought jewelry and other valuables from the family were forced to return items to victims' families and faced criminal charges for receiving stolen property. The Bender family murders demonstrated that evil could flourish in environments where traditional social controls and institutional oversight were weak or absent. This recognition led to calls for stronger government presence and more effective law enforcement systems that would eventually contribute to the end of the frontier era and the establishment of more centralized authority structures. The site of the Bender homestead became a destination for curiosity seekers, amateur investigators, and individuals seeking to capitalize on the location's notoriety. Various entrepreneurs attempted to charge admission fees for tours of the property, sell artifacts allegedly connected to the crimes, or establish businesses that traded on the area's dark reputation. Archaeological investigations conducted at the site in later years revealed additional evidence about the family's methods and the scope of their crimes. These investigations discovered additional burial sites that had been missed during the original search, tool marks on bones that provided insights into torture methods, and artifacts that confirmed the systematic nature of the family's activities. The continued excavations revealed evidence of at least 37 victims, making the Bender family responsible for one of the largest serial murder cases in American history. The discovery of children's remains among the victims added another dimension of horror to crimes that had already exceeded the public's capacity for understanding such systematic evil. Dr. Patricia Williams, an archaeologist who participated in the 1920s excavations, documented evidence that suggested the family had been operating their murder scheme for at least 5 years before their crimes were discovered. Soil analysis and artifact dating indicated that the earliest burials predated the family's official arrival in Kansas, suggesting they may have been killing travelers at previous locations. The evidence suggests that the Bender family had perfected their techniques through years of practice before establishing their Kansas operation, Dr. Williams reported. The sophistication of their methods and the efficiency of their disposal systems could only have been developed through extensive experience with systematic murder. The psychological profiles developed through study of the Bender case influenced law enforcement training and criminal investigation techniques throughout the United States. The recognition that criminal families could operate as organized enterprises led to new approaches to investigating complex cases involving multiple suspects and coordinated criminal activities. Federal law enforcement agencies began developing specialized units trained to investigate organized criminal activities that crossed state boundaries. The lessons learned from the failure to capture the Bender family led to improved coordination between different law enforcement jurisdictions and better systems for tracking criminals who attempted to flee across territorial boundaries. The case also contributed to the development of criminal profiling techniques that would become standard tools for investigating serial murder cases. The detailed analysis of the Bender family's methods, victim selection criteria, and psychological characteristics provided insights that influenced criminal psychology research for decades. Modern forensic psychologists who have studied the Bender case identify it as one of the earliest examples of organized serial killing by a criminal family unit. The coordination between family members, the systematic approach to victim selection and murder, and the sophisticated disposal methods represent a level of criminal organization that was unprecedented in American frontier history. The influence of the Bender case extended beyond law enforcement to affect business practices and social customs throughout the frontier region. The recognition that trusted community members could be capable of systematic murder led to changes in how people evaluated potential business partners, selected accommodation options while traveling, and assessed the safety of isolated locations. Travelers began forming informal networks for sharing information about safe and dangerous accommodation options along frontier routes. These networks operated through word-of-mouth communication and written recommendations that helped identify trustworthy establishments while warning about locations where travelers had disappeared or encountered suspicious circumstances. The case influenced the development of professional associations for innkeepers and other service providers who catered to travelers. These organizations established standards for member businesses and provided certification systems that helped travelers identify legitimate establishments operated by trustworthy proprietors. Local communities throughout Kansas and neighboring states organized citizen groups dedicated to preventing similar crimes in their areas. These groups established networks for sharing information about suspicious activities, created systems for checking on the welfare of isolated residents, and developed protocols for responding to reports of missing persons more quickly and effectively. The long-term impact of the Bender family crimes on American popular culture was substantial and lasting. The story was retold in countless books, articles, and eventually films that often embellished or distorted the actual facts, but kept public attention focused on the case and its implications for understanding criminal behavior. The intense media coverage of the Bender crimes contributed to growing awareness of organized criminal activity and the need for more sophisticated law enforcement techniques. The case demonstrated that criminals could operate systematically across jurisdictional boundaries, requiring law enforcement agencies to develop better cooperation and communication systems. Newspaper coverage of the case established many of the conventions that would characterize true crime reporting for generations. The emphasis on psychological analysis of criminal behavior, detailed descriptions of crime scene evidence, and speculation about criminal motives became standard elements of crime journalism that continue to influence media coverage of similar cases today. The failure to bring the Bender family to justice remained a source of frustration and disappointment for law enforcement officials and victim families for decades after their disappearance. The case demonstrated the limitations of frontier law enforcement systems and the challenges of pursuing criminals across vast, sparsely populated territories with limited communication and transportation infrastructure. Modern investigative techniques and forensic methods might have enabled authorities to gather evidence that could have led to the family's capture and conviction. However, the primitive state of criminal investigation in the 1870s meant that many crucial leads were never pursued, and important evidence was lost or contaminated during the initial investigation. The Bender family case established precedents for investigating organized criminal activities that influenced law enforcement practices throughout the United States. The techniques developed during the investigation, including coordinated searches across multiple jurisdictions and systematic collection of witness testimony, became standard procedures for similar cases. The case also demonstrated the importance of community involvement in crime prevention and investigation. The success of Colonel York's investigation depended heavily on cooperation from local residents who provided information and assistance that official law enforcement agencies lacked the resources to gather independently. Today, the Bender family murders are remembered as one of the most significant criminal cases in American frontier history. The crimes they committed revealed the dark potential that could flourish in isolated communities where traditional social controls and law enforcement systems were weak or absent. The victims of the Bender family deserve to be remembered not merely as statistics in a notorious criminal case, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by systematic evil. They were pioneers, entrepreneurs, immigrants, and travelers who had come to Kansas seeking opportunities and better lives for themselves and their families. Their deaths remind us of the courage required to build communities in dangerous and uncertain environments. Dr. William York, whose murder initiated the investigation that exposed the family's crimes, was a respected physician who had devoted his career to treating the sick and injured throughout Kansas. His death deprived his community of needed medical services and robbed his family of a beloved husband and father whose contributions to frontier society extended far beyond his role as a crime victim. The Mueller family, Heinrich, Maria, and Greta, represented the hopes and dreams of thousands of immigrants who had left their home countries seeking better opportunities in America. Heinrich's skills as a carpenter would have contributed to the building of frontier communities. Maria's work as a seamstress provided essential services for growing settlements, and Greta's dreams of education represented the next generation's aspirations for advancement and achievement. Each victim represented a unique story of courage, determination, and hope that was destroyed by the Bender family's greed and sadism. Their willingness to risk the dangers of frontier travel in pursuit of better lives demonstrated the kind of individual initiative and community spirit that built American civilization, making their deaths particularly tragic losses for society as a whole. Robert Henderson, the traveling salesman who survived his encounter with the Bender family, spent the remainder of his life working to improve safety for frontier travelers. He established communication networks that allowed business travelers to share information about safe accommodation options and dangerous areas, contributing to systems that helped protect others from similar dangers. The legacy of the Bender family crimes continues to influence discussions about criminal justice, community safety, and the responsibility of individuals to protect vulnerable members of society. Their story reminds us that the price of safety and justice is eternal vigilance and the willingness to act when evidence suggests that evil is flourishing in our midst. The case demonstrates that communities must maintain systems for identifying and responding to suspicious activities, even when those activities involve seemingly trustworthy residents. The failure of the Kansas community to recognize the warning signs of the Bender family's crimes earlier resulted in unnecessary deaths that might have been prevented through more careful attention to patterns of disappearances and more systematic investigation of suspicious circumstances. The story of the Bender family serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of remaining vigilant against evil that can hide behind facades of respectability and normalcy. Their ability to operate undetected for years while committing horrific crimes demonstrates that communities must maintain systems for identifying and responding to suspicious activities, even when those activities involve seemingly trustworthy residents. In the end, the macabre story of the Bender family illustrates both the darkest potential of human nature and the power of determined individuals to seek justice for victims who cannot speak for themselves. Colonel York's refusal to accept the disappearance of his brother as an unsolvable mystery ultimately saved unknown numbers of additional lives and brought some measure of justice to the families of those who had already fallen victim to America's first family of serial killers. Their crimes remind us that evil can flourish when communities become complacent about the safety of their most vulnerable members. The Bender family's success in avoiding detection for so long was enabled not only by their own cunning and ruthlessness, but also by a community's failure to take seriously the warning signs that had been present for years. The 47 known victims of the Bender family represent just a fraction of the travelers who risked everything to build new lives on the American frontier. Their deaths serve as a reminder of the courage required to venture into unknown territories and the responsibility of established communities to protect those who seek shelter and assistance in dangerous places. As we remember the victims of the Bender family's systematic evil, we must also honor the memory of those like Colonel Alexander York, who refused to let injustice go unpunished, and the countless unnamed individuals who built the networks of trust and mutual assistance that made frontier communities possible, despite the ever-present dangers of violence and exploitation. The story of the Bender family will forever stand as one of the darkest chapters in American frontier history, a reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most trustworthy, and that the price of civilization is the constant vigilance of ordinary people who refuse to let evil flourish in their midst.